Hi. All right. I think I got it live this time. All right. So we had a couple of questions about how to know which curriculum for creative writing you want for your young folks. So one of our seven sisters was asking because she has an eighth grader who's been doing some really good of the serious, essay writing and, getting the skills down, but hadn't had a chance to do much creative stuff. And so she was wondering what would be the best way to make it available, to do some creativity without ruining things for them, because you want them to be inspired. So those are good questions. Um, all right. So first off, why on earth would you want to do creative writing? And so if you think about the way God made us, God's a creative God. He created everything with his imagination and his words, and he made us in his image. So he made us creative beings to create things, and that's really cool. Um, and so we want to be able to be creative beings for our kids and teach them to be creative. And so teaching them some short story writing and some poetry somewhere, at least in high school, is a good thing. But we found in middle school, especially like seventh or eighth grade, the kids are getting past the everything so literal phase and are ready to do a little creative thinking. So in the comments, I'm going to put some links to different posts we have, especially for fairy tales and movies, that you can kind of introduce a concept. So anyway, um, there are two similar creative writing short story curricula that you can compare if you're thinking about a young writer. And so um, fairy tales and myth fantasies are similar, and that's because they have the roots in each other. So if you think about real fairy tales, so the real, Hans Christian Andersen and the Grimm's brothers, and especially George MacDonald, a lot of you guys, the high schoolers, will read some George MacDonald somewhere in high school. And he was a Scottish pastor in the 1800s who wrote real fairy tales, and they were not like, oh, Tinkerbell, they were fairy tales, and pretty myth fantasy-ish. And so C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were really inspired as they really kicked off the myth fantasy genre in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s. Those eras where it just really took off. Got its roots in George MacDonald. And so to have an introduction to fairy tales in that way, not a Tinkerbell-ish way, which Tinkerbell's cool, fine. But in a real fairy tale, that's a cool thing. And so what our seventh sister Marilyn did is for our middle schoolers that she teaches in our local homeschool groups, she developed a fairy tale writing curriculum that's a 5-day program. And I mean, a 5-week program, 4 days a week. And they go through the basics of writing fairy tales. So let me see if I can do some scrolling here. All right. So has an introduction, and it tells you, 5 weeks, 4 days a week. These are short lessons too, like, 15 minutes, half an hour at the most. And so we start out understanding the elements of the fairy tales. And there's some links to fairy tales that they can read and kind of get an idea that fairy tales aren't fluffy, silly things. Um, I mean, they can be like little kids will read, but they have, there's more meat to them, really. All right, so she coaches them day by day with these little questions that she will ask. And like week 1, lesson 2, they're doing the main character, and she asks questions to sculpt them through how to choose a main character and develop that. Lesson 3 of week 1 is the bad guy, because you have to have a bad guy in a fairy tale. And yeah, she asks them questions to go through that. Lesson 4 is you've got to have your rescuer and some supporting characters, and she helps them get to like the idea of plot twists and things come out of these additional characters that are in fairy tales. All right. And then she helps them in week 2 do your setting. So where and when. And so these are little lessons. Any kid can do it. Some backstory, because you got to have a backstory. You got to know where your characters came from. And then other notable events that will happen in the story. And then that's where they get to actually writing out their plot line. Understand there's a plot line to short stories and especially to fairy tales, and how to work with that plot line. And she coaches them through step by step, what the problem is that they've got to solve, and the climax of the story, and the resolution of the story, and then a rough draft, because they need to learn to get things on paper, so all the steps of the outlining and rough draft, and then final draft. And then, just like all curriculum, she helps them do some editing. And then there's your rubric. All of our Seven Sisters curriculum has a rubric, and that helps the moms to grade. But let me please make sure you know that when you've got a young writer doing something creative, you grade gently. You want them to be encouraged and to know that developing creativity is an ongoing process. All right, now let's look over at the myth fantasy. All right, so myth fantasy is the third short story that we often have our high schoolers write. So first, they generally will do a family narrative. So you take a funny family story, or serious family story, and you write that down, and we coach them through the writing guide on how to do the plot, the character development, the conversation skills, so that they get the guts of how to write a short story without having to come up with all the things. They already know the family members. They already know the story, and so it's a very safe way to get started in that kind of creative process. Then the second short story we usually have them write is the tall tale. And those are so much fun, and everybody should write a tall tale sometime. And so takes them through, what makes a tall tale, and the character development, and all the things that you do with a tall tale. It's just a really fun way to do some creative writing. And then the third one is the myth fantasy. So here's our myth fantasy guide. And here we go. And I want to show you that now it's a 5 weeks. All right. It's 5 days a week instead of 4. And the lessons are more lengthy than the fairy tale, because there's just more thinking and getting things down onto paper that you got to do. But we're not talking like hours a day. So here's some of the things that they will be working on. So they'll work on sub-creation. So, if you think about the Chronicles of Narnia, or the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, there's all these people groups. There's dwarves, like Lord of the Rings. There's dwarves, there's elves, there's Balrogs, there's all these things, in the story, and all this history of the story. If you're much of a Tolkien fan, the Silmarillion, a lot of what that book is just the sub-creation, the backstory for all of the Lord of the Rings, the trilogies, and the Hobbit stories. So those are we delve into sub-creation then. So it's like the backstory, just more of it. And then we talk about a basic myth fantasy storyline development. So there's a definite pattern, a storyline to a myth fantasy story. And then the character development, how you grow your characters through the way they converse. Like, in Lord of the Rings, the elves are very royal, very, very sophisticated, very understated in how they talk and behave. And dwarves are rough and gruff and growly, and how they behave and talk. And so you see, characters grow through their personalities. Work a lot on symbolism. Is very, very important in myth fantasy to include symbolism. So like C.S. Lewis will throw in, ancient Greek myth characters in there as symbols for things, like in the Chronicles of Narnia, the silver chair. That story's symbolism is based around Plato's allegory of the cave. And so if you know how to capture symbolism, you can capture meaning into your story in a very subtle way. And the reason why like Lewis and Tolkien and a lot of the fantasy writers write these days is they are trying to help connect people to meaning. Our world can get so self-centered and so busy that we lose our sense of purpose and meaning. And so this kind of helps them, connect to that. All right. And then there's foreshadowing, how you capture, like breadcrumbs that lets, the reader know this something is coming and, gets them on alert. And then one of the most important parts of the myth fantasy is the return to old truths. And so in all of the Lewis and Tolkien and most even of the modern the fantasy writers is there will be an old truth that the reader and the characters in the story will rediscover or discover for the first time, like generosity or friendship or kindness or sacrifice. That these are old truths, like God made us to be this way, and we forget in the chaos of the world, and so it recalibrates the characters. So that's part of a myth fantasy. And then friendships is very, very important in myth fantasy. If you think about the characters in the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings in particular, those are the ones I draw on because I'm a Tolkien and Lewis geek. But there's elves and dwarves learn how to be friends, and hobbits learn how to be friends with all of them. And in the Chronicles of Narnia, you've got the humans, and you've got the all the different myth characters that they're interacting with, like, oh, we're just normal, unicorns and Mr. Tumnus and all, like they're all different, and so they learn like creatures of difference can work together to solve problems to make the world a better place. All right. And so friendships are very important. And so we work through those in chunks. So 5 weeks, and they end up with a short story. And we always tell kids, you do not want to write a book, your first myth fantasy. You start out getting the skills and the framework, and then you can write a book if you want to, if you get inspired. Okay. All right. So how do you choose? All right. So, do you want to do a nice, easy fairy tale or really dive deep into a myth fantasy? And you know what? There's not one right way to homeschool. And so you do what's best for you. Your kids. So the most important thing is to know your goal. What is your goal? And so, if the goal is to introduce creativity, it might be nice just to have an easy, gentle introduction with the fairy tales. If you've got a teen or a young teen who's so intense, they are so intense, or they already have some creative writing, or they're really, really versed in the genre already because they read it all the time and watch all the movies. Yeah, there's no reason you can't jump ahead. So anyway, you can look over the details. Know that the myth fantasy it's intense, because we're covering symbolism. We're talking about friendships, and we're talking about foreshadowing. So there are these backstory things and these story elements that are really, really important for a traditional framework myth fantasy. And again, there's not one right way to do this, and so you do what's best for you. But whatever you do on your young person's first short story, please grade them gently. We are not trying to do it right. We are trying to help them learn to think creatively. And if you give them that gift, oh my goodness, they can go on and do some really awesome things. So, all righty. Hopefully that answers a few questions. And we love questions in the Facebook group, because a lot of times, not just as seven sisters, like Kim or Sabrina or me or our wonderful Stacy will be jumping in there answering, but also all of our seventh siblings, all the moms and dads who are already homeschooling, can share their ideas too. And we've got some really, really cool friends there in the Facebook group. So, be sure and avail yourself of that. All righty. That's enough. I've got to run and talk to my counseling clients now. So we will catch up with you next week. Keep the questions coming, and God bless you all.